The man sitting across from me is somewhere in his 70s. His hands are large, the kind of large that isn't genetic but built, constructed over decades of hitting things harder than hands were designed to hit. His knuckles are flattened. Not broken, remodeled. Reshaped by 10,000 impacts against makiwara boards, heavy bags, the compacted rice straw striking posts that traditional karate uses to turn human hands into something closer to masonry tools. He holds his coffee with those hands, and the cup looks fragile in them, like something that exists only because he's choosing not to close his grip. He hasn't given me his name. He won't. He doesn't want his school identified, doesn't want his students reading this and asking questions he still can't answer. What he wants, and I think this is the only reason he agreed to talk after 3 months of emails and 2 unreturned phone calls, is for someone to hear this story and take it seriously. Not as mythology. Not as another impossible Bruce Lee anecdote to stack on the pile of impossible Bruce Lee anecdotes. As a thing that happened to a real person in a real room and bent the entire arc of his life into a shape he hadn't planned for. I've been teaching karate for 45 years, he says. I've trained champions. Regional, national, international. I've broken boards, broken bones, broken men who thought they could walk into my school and walk out the same way they came in. He pauses. Sets the coffee down. And I have spent 30 of those 45 years trying to understand 6 seconds in a small room in Los Angeles. I still can't explain them. I don't think I ever will. 6 seconds. I'm going to keep coming back to that number. Because 6 seconds is one breath. One inhale, one exhale. The time it takes to read this sentence aloud. That's all the time it took to dismantle 15 years of training, a regional championship, a 240-pound body built for combat, and a belief system so deeply embedded that it wasn't just what this man practiced, it was who he was. In the last story I told you, James Coburn was paying $275 an hour to a man most of Hollywood had never heard of. He drove to a side street twice a week and left an envelope on a shelf and stood where a smaller man told him to stand. Hollywood laughed. Coburn didn't explain. But there was someone in Coburn's orbit who wasn't laughing. Someone who was angry. Who believed his friend was being taken for a ride by a small Chinese con man with fast hands and a good sales pitch. Who decided, with the righteous certainty of a man who has never had his certainty tested, to do something about it. He decided to go to that small room and expose the fraud. This is the story of what happened when he got there. I need to tell you up front, this story has a simpler evidence trail than the corridor incident from the first video. There aren't 3 contradictory witnesses. There's essentially one, the karatist himself, telling me what happened from the inside, 30+ years after the fact. Memory is imperfect. 30 years of retelling reshapes any story. I know that. He knows that. But the core details, the sequence of events, the physical mechanics, the outcome are consistent with what I've been able to verify through other sources. And the emotional truth of it, the thing it did to him, the way it rearranged his life, that's not the kind of thing a person fabricates. You can see it in his hands when he talks about it. The way they go still. The way a man who has spent 45 years in motion becomes, for a moment, completely motionless. There's a detail about what Bruce did in those 6 seconds, a specific technical choice, that I didn't understand until I showed the reconstructed sequence to a biomechanics professor at UCLA. Her reaction is part of this story. But it comes later. And after those 6 seconds, the karatist asked Bruce to do it again. What happened the second time was, in some ways, more devastating than the first. We'll get there too. First, I need to show you who this man was before he walked through Bruce Lee's door. Because what happened to him in that room doesn't mean anything unless you understand what he was carrying when he walked in. His name doesn't matter. I'll call him what he was, the karatist. Not because he doesn't deserve a name, but because in this story, his identity is his practice. His name is the thing he'd built himself into over 15 years. And that thing was karate. He started at 14. 1952, roughly, the math is approximate because he's vague about dates, protective of the timeline the way people are protective of things that locate them too precisely in history. 14 years old, walking into a dojo for the first time, and the world suddenly making sense in a way it hadn't before. This is something that non-martial artists sometimes struggle to understand, so let me try to explain it. For certain people, people built a certain way, wired a certain way, carrying a certain restlessness in their muscles that ordinary life doesn't address, the first time they enter a dojo is not a recreational experience. It's a homecoming. The structured violence. The hierarchy. The discipline that organizes chaos into form. The feeling of a fist striking a target and the target giving way and the body understanding, in a language deeper than words, that it was designed for this. That all the excess energy, the aggression, the physical intensity that civilian life treats as a problem is, in this room, a resource. The karatist felt that at 14. And he never looked back. He trained with the fervor of a convert. 4 days a week became 5. 5 became 6. He punched the makiwara until his knuckles bled, then wrapped them and punched again. He kicked the heavy bag until his shins developed the dense, layered calluses that traditional karate fighters wear like credentials. He practiced kata, the formal patterns that encode techniques into sequences, hundreds of times, thousands of times, until the movements lived in his body the way language lives in the mouth, automatic, fluid, available without thought. He moved through the belt system with the steady inevitability of a man who has found the thing he is supposed to do. White to yellow. Yellow to green. Green to brown. Brown to black. Each belt a confirmation. Each promotion a signal from the universe that he was on the correct path, doing the correct thing, becoming the correct version of himself. By 20, he was a black belt. By 23, he was competing. By 25, he was winning not everything, not consistently, but enough. Regional tournaments in Southern California, where the karate community in the early 60s was small, intense, and convinced of its own supremacy. He won with the tools his training had given him: power, speed, precision, and the absolute conviction that the system he'd been taught was the complete system. The ultimate system. The system against which all other systems would be measured and found wanting. By 1967, he was 29 years old. 15 years of training. Regional champion. 240 pounds, not bodybuilder bulk, but functional mass. Dense. Thick wrist. A chest that filled a GI jacket the way concrete fills a form. His hands, by this point, were weapons in the most literal sense: the knuckle calluses, the forearm density, the grip strength developed by years of makiwara training had turned them into objects that could break boards, break bricks, break bones, and he had done all three. He was not stupid. I want to be clear about that because the story is going to make him look foolish, and foolishness is not the same as stupidity. He was intelligent, articulate, analytical within his framework. The problem was the framework. The problem was that 15 years of immersion in a single system had done what immersion always does: it had made the system invisible. He didn't see karate as one approach among many. He saw it as the approach. The standard. The lens through which all martial arts were evaluated, and through which all other martial arts were found to be, in various ways, deficient. Chinese martial arts were particularly suspect. He'd seen kung fu demonstrations at tournaments, the flowing forms, the animal stances, the elaborate choreography that looked beautiful and, to his trained eye, accomplished nothing. Where was the power? Where was the impact? Where was the moment when a fist met a target and the target stopped existing as a problem? Chinese martial arts were dance. That was his assessment. Informed by 15 years of punching things that broke when he punched them. Dance. He knew about Bruce Lee. Not much. Bruce wasn't famous in 1967, wasn't on anyone's radar except the small martial arts community and the people who'd caught his brief appearance on the Green Hornet. What the karatist knew was filtered through the gossip network that connected Hollywood's martial arts instructors. A Chinese guy was teaching some celebrities. Charging a fortune. Claiming to have developed a new approach that transcended traditional styles. Transcended traditional styles. Those three words were, to the karatist, a declaration of war. Traditional styles were not things to be transcended. They were things to be honored, practiced, perfected, and defended. The idea that some small Chinese man in a t-shirt could improve upon centuries of Japanese martial tradition was not merely wrong, it was offensive. It was the kind of thing that a fraud would say. A con man. Someone who had learned just enough to impress civilians but who would crumble instantly, completely, when confronted by someone real. His connection to Coburn was through Hollywood's martial arts fringe, the loose network of instructors, stuntmen, and enthusiasts who circled the entertainment industry. He wasn't Coburn's teacher, but they knew each other. They'd talked at events. They'd shared the easy camaraderie of men who speak the same physical language. And when word reached him that James Coburn, the man from the Magnificent Seven, a man the karatist respected, was paying $275 an hour to a Chinese martial artist, the karatist's reaction was not curiosity. It was alarm. Coburn was being scammed. Obviously. A small Chinese man with quick hands and a gift for showmanship had bamboozled a rich movie star into writing checks for lessons that were, the karatist was certain, nothing more than elaborate performance. He'd seen this before, or believed he had. The martial arts world was full of charlatans, men who could demonstrate impressive-looking techniques against compliant partners and who fell apart the moment someone threw a real punch with real intent. Bruce Lee was one of these men. He had to be. Because the alternative, that Bruce Lee was genuine, that his approach worked, that traditional karate might not be the complete and ultimate system the karatist had built his life around, was not an alternative the karatist's psyche could accommodate. So he made a decision. He would go to Bruce Lee's school. He would challenge the man. He would expose the fraud with the straightforward efficiency that 15 years of karate had taught him, a confrontation, a sparring match, a direct and physical demonstration that size and training in the supreme art of karate would always prevail over whatever soft Chinese tricks this con man was selling. He wasn't doing this to be cruel. This is important. He wasn't motivated by malice or racism, or at least, not by the conscious kind. He was motivated by the same thing that drives most acts of righteous confrontation, the conviction that he was right, that his friend was being harmed, and that the truth needed to be demonstrated physically because words weren't sufficient. He was, in his own mind, doing a good thing. Protecting a friend. Defending the art. Setting the record straight. He called Coburn. Told him he wanted to visit Bruce's school. Coburn, to his credit, didn't argue. Didn't warn Bruce. Didn't try to manage the situation. He simply gave the karatist the address and the time and said something like, "Go see for yourself." Which, in retrospect, was either extraordinary confidence in Bruce Lee or extraordinary confidence that the universe would sort this out without Coburn's help. The karatist drove to the school on a Thursday afternoon. I know the day of the week because he told me he remembers it the way people remember the day of a car accident or a diagnosis. The day the road changed direction. He drove through Los Angeles in the late afternoon, the sun angling through the windshield, the city doing what Los Angeles always does in the late afternoon, turning golden and indifferent and impossibly beautiful in that way that has nothing to do with the people in it. He parked. He got out. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the door. The exterior confirmed everything he believed. A plain door on a quiet street. No sign, or a small one, he can't remember, which tells me it wasn't impressive enough to register. No display window. No trophies in a case. No photographs of the instructor with famous students. None of the signals that a legitimate martial arts school uses to announce its presence and its credentials to the world. His dojo had all of those things. Trophies in the lobby. His competition photograph, a younger version of himself in a pristine white GI, mid-technique, a judge's flag raised in his favor, framed and mounted behind the front desk. Rows of black belts with names embroidered in gold thread. A visible, physical record of achievement and legitimacy. Bruce Lee's school had none of it. The absence was, to the karatist, a confession. He was already composing his speech to Coburn. Already rehearsing the phone call. "James, I went. I saw. There's nothing there. A small room and a small man and nothing on the walls and nothing in his hands but a good line of talk. You're being played, and I'm telling you this as a friend." He walked to the door. He opened it. The room was smaller than he expected. smaller than his own dojo by half, maybe more. Mirrors along one wall, he recognized those. Every martial arts school had mirrors. A wooden dummy in the corner, the kind used in Wing Chun, a Chinese art that the karatist had seen demonstrated and dismissed. The floor was clean. Bare. No mats or minimal mats. The space smelled of wood and a faint citrus cleaning scent, and the particular staleness of a room that is used for physical activity and cleaned regularly but never quite loses the undertone of human effort. No trophies. No photographs. No wall of certificates or newspaper clippings or the visual autobiography that most martial arts schools construct to tell visitors who they're dealing with. The walls were close to bare. The room offered no evidence. No credential. No argument for its own legitimacy. It simply was what it was, a space for training. Nothing more. And in the center of it, a man. Bruce Lee was wearing a black t-shirt. Dark pants. Bare feet on the clean floor. He was compact, that's the word the karatist uses, and I think it's precise. Not small, though he was small by any objective measurement. Compact. Everything pulled in tight, everything dense, everything organized around a center that you could feel even before you understood what you were feeling. He looked like a man who had been compressed, as if a normal-sized person had been reduced in dimension but not in content. The karatist outweighed him by over 100 pounds. He was taller by 4 or 5 inches. His shoulders were wider, his arms were longer, his reach advantage was significant. In every physical comparison that the karatist's 15 years of training had taught him to make, he was the superior specimen. The larger frame. The heavier weapon. The body that would win because physics said it would win, and physics didn't care about technique or philosophy or $275 an hour. Bruce greeted him. A handshake. Not the elaborate bowing protocol of a Japanese dojo, no mutual bow, no formal acknowledgement of rank, no ritualized expression of respect. A handshake. Eye contact. And in that eye contact, something the karatist noticed and immediately tried to dismiss: calm. Not the tense calm of a man preparing for a confrontation. Not the false calm of a man pretending he isn't nervous. Real calm. The settled, depthless calm of a lake that has been still for a long time and has no reason to expect disturbance. The karatist found this irritating. Calm, in his experience, was either earned through demonstrated superiority or faked as a bluff. A 135-pound man facing a 240-pound karate champion should not be calm. He should be alert. Wary. Calculating his options, which were limited. The calm was either an act, a con man's poise, or it was something the karatist didn't have a category for. He chose to believe it was an act. He didn't waste time. Pleasantries were not what he'd come for. He told Bruce what he was there to do: spar. Test skills. See what this was really about. He didn't frame it as a challenge, not in those words. He framed it as a professional inquiry. One martial artist visiting another. An exchange. But the subtext was thick enough to walk on, and Bruce Lee was not a man who missed subtext. Bruce's response was 3 words. Whenever you're ready. No hesitation. No qualification. No let me warm up or let me explain the rules, or perhaps we should discuss our respective styles first. No ceremony of any kind. Just immediate, casual, almost disinterested agreement. As if the karatist had asked to use the bathroom rather than challenged him to a fight. The karatist registered this and filed it in the only folder his framework had available: arrogance. The bluff of a man who knows he's outmatched and is hiding it behind performance. Confidence as camouflage. He'd seen it before: small men in dojos who acted unimpressed right up until the moment they got hit and the act dissolved. He began composing the next sentence of his speech to Coburn. And then I asked him to spar, and he said, whenever you're ready, like he was ordering coffee. And James, let me tell you what happened next. What happened next took 6 seconds. And the karatist never gave that speech. They stood 8 feet apart. The room shrank around them, not literally, but in the way that space compresses when 2 bodies prepare to collide. The mirrors doubled everything. Two karatists. Two Bruces. Two versions of what was about to happen, reflected back at the room with the indifference of glass. The karatist settled into his stance. It was beautiful. I say that without irony and without condescension, because I've spent enough time around martial arts to know what 15 years of practice looks like when it resolves into a single position. His front stance, Zenkutsudachi in the Japanese, was textbook. Left foot forward, right foot back, weight distributed 60-40. Hands up, fists closed, elbows tucked. Chin down. Eyes level. Every joint at the angle prescribed by tradition. Every muscle engaged in the precise ratio that his instructors had drilled into him since he was a teenager, punching makiwara boards until his knuckles wept. It was the product of 10,000 repetitions. A body organized by decades of practice into a shape that said, in a language older than English and more honest, I am ready. I know what I am doing. I have trained for this. Bruce stood in something else. The karatist looked at it and felt a small, sharp jolt of satisfaction. Because what Bruce was standing in was not a stance. It wasn't anything. His feet were roughly shoulder-width apart. His weight was centered, not shifted forward into aggression or backward into defense. His knees were slightly bent, but not in any formalized way. His hands were low. Not up protecting the chin, not chambered at the hip in the karate-ready position, not in any guard from any system the karatist had ever studied or seen or read about. Just low. Hanging. Relaxed in a way that, to someone trained in the formal architecture of fighting stances, looked like negligence. Like a man who didn't know where to put his hands because no one had ever taught him. The karatist's internal assessment was instant and absolute: amateur. This man doesn't know how to stand. He doesn't know how to guard. He's 135 pounds with his hands down and his chin exposed, and I'm going to show him what 15 years of real training looks like. He didn't know, couldn't have known, because his framework had no provision for the concept that what he was looking at was not an absence of stance but a transcendence of stance. Bruce had studied every stance, from every major system, and he had arrived at the conclusion that predetermined positions were limitations. A stance commits you. It tells your opponent where your weight is, which techniques are available from that position, which angles are open and which are closed. A stance is a sentence that's already half written, and Bruce preferred to start from silence. From neutral. From a position that committed to nothing and therefore contained everything. But the karatist didn't know any of that. He knew what he saw: a small man with his hands down. An invitation. He attacked. The technique he chose was the straight punch oizuki. The foundational strike of Shotokan karate. He'd thrown this punch 10,000 times. Not a rough estimate, he once calculated it, adding up the repetitions from 15 years of practice, and the number was somewhere north of 10,000. He'd thrown it at targets, at air, at makiwara boards, at heavy bags, at sparring partners who ranged from beginners who flinched to black belts who countered. He knew this punch the way a pianist knows a scale, from the inside, in the dark, without conscious thought. It was fast. 240 pounds of trained muscle driving forward through a hip rotation that started at the floor and cascaded upward through the kinetic chain: ankle, knee, hip, torso, shoulder, arm, fist. The punch carried everything. His weight, his training, his 15 years of certainty, his conviction that this was the moment the fraud would be exposed. It hit nothing. His fist passed through the space where Bruce Lee's centerline had been, the exact space, the precise coordinates where 135 pounds of compact human being had been standing a fraction of a second earlier, and arrived at air. At absence. At the place where a target should have been and was not. Bruce wasn't there. Not dramatically not there. He hadn't leaped sideways or ducked or executed any of the evasive techniques the karatist had seen in kung fu demonstrations. He had shifted. Inches. The minimum viable displacement, just enough that the fist sailed past his body with the thin margin of a near miss, close enough that the karatist could feel the heat of Bruce's body as his arm extended through the space where that body had been. The karatist's brain registered three things simultaneously. First, the punch missed. Second, the punch never misses, not at this range, not with this commitment, not against a man standing still with his hands down. Third, the small man had not moved enough. The displacement was insufficient. By any reasonable analysis of distance and reaction time, the amount Bruce had moved should not have been enough to avoid a committed straight punch from 8 feet closing to contact range. It was like watching someone step off a train track by 6 inches and having the train miss them. Technically possible. Functionally impossible. The margin was too thin for human reaction time. But the punch missed. That was a fact. The fact existed regardless of its impossibility. And now the karatist was in trouble. His punch was extended. His arm was out, fully committed, fully elongated, a 240-pound body behind a fist that had reached maximum extension and found nothing to stop against. In karate, this is a recoverable position. The system accounts for missed punches. You retract, haikite, the pulling hand. You reset. You return to your stance, your base, your starting position, and you try again. The recovery is built into the technique. It's part of the 10,000 repetitions. It's automatic. In karate, you have time for this. In Jeet Kune Do, you don't. Because Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist, is built on a single, devastating premise: the most vulnerable moment in any attack is the moment of fullest commitment. When a punch is fully extended, the attacker is structurally compromised. Their weight is forward. Their balance is distributed along the line of the attack. Their ability to change direction, to adjust, to respond to new information, is at its absolute minimum. They are a train on a track, and the track only goes one way, and the train cannot stop. In karate, this moment is a brief transition, a fraction of a second between extension and recovery. In Jeet Kune Do, this moment is the entire fight. Bruce had been waiting for it. Not hoping for it, not reacting to it. Waiting. The way a fisherman waits for a specific ripple on the surface of a specific stretch of water. He had read the karatist's body, the weight shift, the shoulder drop, the eye movement toward target, and he had known, before the punch began, what was coming, when it would arrive, and precisely how far to move to make it miss. The evasion wasn't a reaction. It was a plan that had been completed before the karatist's fist left his hip. And now, with the punch extended and the karatist's 240 pounds committed forward along a line that led to nothing, Bruce moved. Not a big movement. Not a spinning back kick or a flying knee or any of the dramatic, cinematic techniques that the word counterattack conjures in the mind of someone raised on martial arts movies. Something small. Precise. A movement that the karatist didn't recognize, not then, not at full speed, not from inside the disorientation of a missed punch that had never missed before. Bruce's hand made contact with the karatist's extended arm. Not a strike, not in the way the karatist understood strikes. A touch. A redirection. An application of pressure that was angular rather than linear, applied not against the arm but along it, using the arm as a lever to access the thing behind the arm. 240 pounds of forward momentum with no target to absorb it. I need to pause here because this is the technical detail I didn't understand until much later. What Bruce did in this fraction of a second was not a block, not a parry, not any of the defensive techniques that exist in traditional martial arts. It was an interception, and the distinction matters. A block stops force. A parry redirects it. An interception meets force at the moment of maximum commitment and minimum recoverability, and instead of stopping or redirecting, it amplifies. It takes the energy the attacker has already committed and adds to it, not much, not with brute force, but with a precisely angled vector that turns the attacker's own momentum into the mechanism of their defeat. The karatist felt it before he understood it. His 240 pounds, which had been moving forward in a straight line, were suddenly moving forward and downward and to the right. His balance, the foundation, the base, the thing that 15 years of stance training had made automatic, dissolved. Not because Bruce had overpowered him. Because Bruce had agreed with him. Had taken the direction the karatist's body was already going and said, in effect, yes. Go there. Go there faster. Go there more completely. Let me help. 240 pounds is a lot of mass to redirect. In judo, it requires a grip, a hip entry, a committed throw that takes time and leverage and physical effort. What Bruce did required none of those things. He didn't throw the karatist. He didn't tackle him or sweep his legs or apply any technique that the karatist's training had prepared him to recognize and counter. He simply found the vector that the karatist's own attack had created and opened a door along that vector that led to the floor. The karatist went through it. Not violently. Not with the crashing impact of a judo throw or the dramatic collapse of a knockout. He went to the floor the way water goes over a ledge, following the path of least resistance, obeying physics, arriving at a destination that felt inevitable even though, a second earlier, it had been inconceivable. His 240 pounds met the clean floor of Bruce Lee's school with a sound that was more thud than slap, more settling than crashing. The sound of a large object arriving at a lower elevation. He was on his back. Looking up. The ceiling of Bruce Lee's school was unremarkable. White or off-white. A light fixture, fluorescent or incandescent, he doesn't remember. What he remembers is the view. The view of a ceiling you didn't plan to see. The view of a world that has rotated 90 degrees without your permission. Bruce was standing. In the same place. Or close to the same place, the karatist isn't sure. Because his spatial processing was compromised by the experience of being horizontal when he'd expected to be vertical. Bruce's hands were at his sides. His breathing was normal. His expression contained nothing that the karatist could read as triumph or satisfaction or the particular gloating that fighters sometimes display after a successful technique. Bruce looked the way he'd looked before the exchange, calm. Patient. Waiting. As if what had just happened was so unremarkable, so routine, so thoroughly expected that it didn't warrant a change in facial expression. The karatist lay on the floor and felt the silence. It wasn't the silence of the room had its own sounds, the way all rooms do. The faint hum of electricity in the walls. A car passing outside, its engine note rising and falling with the Doppler indifference of a city that doesn't know or care what's happening inside its buildings. The sound of the karatist's own breathing, which was heavier than it should have been. 6 seconds of activity. 1 punch. 1 displacement. 1 trip to the floor. His heart rate should not have been elevated. His breathing should not have been disrupted. But both were, because the physiological response wasn't to the physical exertion, it was to the cognitive event. His body was processing the adrenaline of something his brain couldn't file. The silence was inside him. In the place where his framework lived. The filing system, superior, inferior. Real, fake. Hard, soft. Large, small. Karate, everything else. The categories that had organized his understanding of the world for 15 years were not collapsing, that's too dramatic a word. They were dissolving. Losing their edges. Running together like watercolors in rain, the lines between them becoming uncertain, the distinctions that had seemed absolute a minute ago revealing themselves to be arbitrary. Constructed. Chosen. 6 seconds. He'd been a regional champion. He'd fought men who were bigger, faster, more experienced, more aggressive. He'd been hit, taken down, submitted in training, pushed to the edges of his physical capabilities by competitors who were world-class in their own right. None of it, not one moment in 15 years of training and competition, had prepared him for what had just happened. Because what had just happened was not a defeat. A defeat he could have processed. A defeat fits inside the framework: you lose, you analyze, you adjust, you train harder, you come back. A defeat is a data point within the system. This was not within the system. This was a demonstration that the system itself was incomplete. That the karate he'd spent 15 years perfecting was not the complete picture but a partial one. A chapter in a longer book. A sentence in a larger paragraph. And the man standing above him in a t-shirt, with his hands at his sides and his breathing unchanged, was reading from a page the karatist didn't know existed. He got up. Slowly. Not because he was hurt, he wasn't. Nothing was damaged. No joint had been wrenched, no bone had been struck, no soft tissue had been traumatized. He'd been put on the floor by his own momentum, guided there by a hand that had touched his arm for less than a second. He was physically fine. He was everything else not fine. He stood. He looked at Bruce. And here is where the story splits from what I expected, from what the movie version of this encounter would script. In the movie version, the karatist gets angry. He attacks again, wilder this time, fueled by humiliation and rage. There's a longer fight, a more dramatic conclusion, a clearer moment of surrender. That's not what happened. What happened was a question. The karatist looked at Bruce Lee, looked at this man who weighed 100 pounds less than him and had just made 15 years of training irrelevant in 6 seconds, and he asked, "Can you do that again?" Not, "How did you do that?" Not, "What was that?" Not anger, not accusation, not the defensive posturing of a man whose ego has been wounded. A simple, genuine, almost childlike request. Can you do that again? The question of a person who has just seen something that their brain could not process at full speed and needs a second viewing. The question of a man whose certainty has cracked and who is, for the first time in 15 years, genuinely curious. Bruce's response was not what the karatist expected. He didn't repeat the technique. Didn't offer a slow-motion demonstration or a step-by-step breakdown. He said, "Attack me again." Different technique this time. Different technique. The instruction was important, and the karatist understood why only later. Bruce wasn't performing a trick. A trick works once, against one specific input, and can be replicated exactly because it depends on specific conditions. What Bruce had done was not a trick. It was a principle. And a principle works regardless of the input. Different technique. Prove to yourself that this isn't a gimmick. Come at me a different way and watch the same thing happen through a different mechanism. The karatist attacked. A front kick this time, imagery, another fundamental technique, launched from the back leg with the speed and power that 15 years of practice had made automatic. The hip drove forward. The knee chambered. The foot extended toward Bruce's midsection with the force of 240 pounds behind it. 6 seconds. Different mechanics. Different interception. The same outcome. The karatist on the floor. Bruce standing. Hands at sides. Breathing unchanged. The same patient expression. The same calm. The karatist got up. Faster this time. The hesitation of the first recovery was gone, replaced by something urgent. Not anger. Something more productive than anger. He attacked again. And this time, he abandoned karate. This is the detail that I find most revealing, because it happened unconsciously. He didn't decide to stop using karate. His body decided. Somewhere in the space between the second failure and the third attempt, his 15 years of training stopped being the solution and started being the problem, and his body is smarter, in this moment, than his conscious mind reached for something outside the system. Something unrefined. Something desperate. A grab. A forward rush. A bull charge that had no technique behind it, no system, no name. Just 240 pounds of mass moving forward with the intention of making contact through sheer volume and commitment. 6 seconds. Different again. Same floor. Same ceiling. Same silence. 3 times. 3 different attacks. 3 different interceptions. 3 identical conclusions. The karatist on the ground. Bruce above him. The principle proven through variation. This is not a technique. This is not a trick that works against straight punches or front kicks or bull rushes. This is a way of understanding force, momentum, commitment, and the structural vulnerabilities that exist in every attack, from every system, at every speed and angle. This is physics. And physics doesn't care what color your belt is. The karatist didn't ask for a 4th time. He sat on the floor. Not the dramatic sitting of defeat, the quiet sitting of a man who needs to be closer to the ground because the ground is the most stable thing in a world that has just become very unstable. He sat cross-legged on the clean floor of Bruce Lee's school and he looked at the man in the t-shirt and he felt, for the first time since he was 14 years old, genuinely ignorant. Not the ignorance of someone who hasn't studied, he'd studied more than almost anyone. The ignorance of someone who has studied deeply within a boundary and has just discovered that the boundary was artificial. That the territory extends far beyond the map he was given. He asked, "What was that?" Bruce's answer, and this is paraphrased through 30 years of memory and the particular compression that happens when a pivotal conversation is retold many times, was not technical. He didn't name a technique. He didn't cite a system. He said something close to this. That was you. Your momentum. Your commitment. Your decision to attack in a straight line when the world isn't straight. I didn't beat you. Your assumptions beat you. I just helped them. Your assumptions beat you. I just helped them. Let that settle. Because there is a world of philosophy compressed into that sentence. Bruce didn't claim superiority. Didn't claim that Jeet Kune Do was better than karate, that Chinese martial arts were better than Japanese martial arts, that his system had defeated the karatist system. He said something more radical than any of that. He said, "I didn't do anything to you. I let you do something to yourself. Your own momentum, your own commitment, your own trust in a system that told you to move in straight lines, those were the weapons that put you on the floor. I just opened the door and let them work." The karatist sat with this. I imagine the room was quiet, the late afternoon quiet of a small space in Los Angeles, the sunlight angling lower through the high window, the wooden dummy standing in the corner like a witness that had seen this before and would see it again. The mirrors reflecting two men, one sitting, one standing, in a room where something had just ended and something else had just begun. I showed this sequence reconstructed from the karatist's own description, supplemented by Bruce Lee's documented technical writings on interception theory, to a sports biomechanics professor at UCLA. She specializes in force vector analysis and kinetic chain dynamics in combat sports. I won't use her name, she didn't want her department associated with what she called martial arts mythology, which tells you something about how the academic world views these stories even now. She watched my reconstruction twice. I'd animated it crudely, stick figures on a whiteboard, with force vectors drawn as arrows and the moment of interception highlighted. She didn't say anything for about 30 seconds. She rewound to the interception point. Watched it a third time. Then she said, "The person who did this understood kinetic chains before we had a name for them. He's not fighting the attacker. He's fighting the attacker's physics. He's using the mass against itself, not like judo, which requires grip and leverage and committed physical contact over a duration. This is something else. This is interception at the moment of maximum commitment and minimum recoverability. That's a window of approximately 0.2 of a second. A window that changes based on the speed, mass, and technique of the attacker. To find that window in real time, against a committed attacker, with an unfamiliar technique," she paused here, "requires processing speed that I don't have a model for." She looked at me. "Who did you say this was?" I told her. She nodded. "That tracks," she said. "I've seen his film footage. The speed is anomalous. But speed alone doesn't explain this. Speed gets you to the window. Knowing what to do when you get there, that's something else. That's comprehension. Of biomechanics, of force vectors, of the structural vulnerabilities inherent in every committed movement. We started naming these concepts in the 1980s. He was applying them in the 1960s. She paused again. Then, I can explain how a piano works. That doesn't help me play Chopin. I asked her if she thought Bruce's interception could be taught. If the karatist could have learned it. She thought about it. The principle, yes. Absolutely. The principle is elegant and scientifically sound. The execution at that speed, with that precision, against a live attacker? She shook her head. That's not a skill. That's a gift. And gifts don't transfer. The karatist didn't leave that afternoon. He had arrived planning to stay 15 minutes, long enough to spar, long enough to win, long enough to confirm what he already knew and collect the evidence for his phone call to Coburn. He stayed for hours. They talked. Not about fighting, or not only about fighting. About philosophy. About the difference between a system and a principle. About why traditions calcify, why a martial art that began as a living, evolving response to real combat hardens, over generations, into ritual. Into forms performed for their own sake. Into techniques practiced 10,000 times not because they work but because they've been practiced 9,999 times before, and stopping now would mean admitting that the previous repetitions were incomplete. Bruce talked about water. He talked about it the way he always talked about it, not as a metaphor but as an operating principle. Water doesn't have a stance. Water doesn't commit to a single direction. Water fills the shape of whatever contains it, and when the container breaks, water goes where gravity takes it, without resistance, without predetermined form. You put water in a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water in a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put water in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. The karatist had heard this kind of talk before, from kung fu practitioners at tournaments, from books about Eastern philosophy, from the general cultural fog of martial arts mysticism that hung over the 1960s. He'd dismissed it as poetry. Decoration. The kind of thing people say when they can't fight. But he was sitting on the floor of a man who had just put him there 3 times in 18 seconds. The poetry was no longer abstract. It was annotated. It had footnotes, and the footnotes were written on his back in the language of hardwood floor. By evening, the light through the high window had gone from gold to amber to the thin gray of Los Angeles dusk. The karatist was still in the room. His car was still on the street. His 15 years of certainty were on the floor next to him, and he was examining them the way you examine a broken object, turning the pieces over, trying to see where the fracture lines had been hiding all along. He didn't call Coburn that night to say, "I told you so." He called Coburn that night and said almost nothing. Coburn listened to the silence. Then Coburn said something that the karatist remembers word for word, 30 years later. "Now you understand why I don't explain it. Because the real thing can't be explained. It can only be experienced. You can describe water to someone who's never touched it. You can talk about wetness, fluidity, temperature, the way it shapes itself to whatever contains it. But until they put their hand in it, until they feel it close around their fingers with that total, formless, irresistible compliance, they don't know water. They know the word. The word is not the thing. $275 an hour. That's what Coburn was paying. And now the karatist understood the price the way you understand the cost of a surgery that saved your life. Not as an expense. As a bargain. The karatist went home. He didn't sleep. Not from agitation, from activity. His mind was doing something it hadn't done in years, moving. Not in the repetitive circles of practice and refinement within a known system, but in open space. Across boundaries. Into territory he'd spent 15 years pretending didn't exist. The next morning, he walked into his own school. His dojo. The place where he'd been teaching karate for the better part of a decade. He stood in the doorway and he looked at what he'd built. Students in white GIs, standing in rows. Colored belts arranged in order of rank, white at the back, brown at the front, a hierarchy visible, physical, unquestioned. They were performing kata. Synchronized. Arms extending at the same angle. Feet landing at the same moment. Kiais, the sharp shouts that punctuate karate techniques erupting in unison, a sound like a single voice from 20 throats. It was beautiful. It was disciplined. It was everything he had spent 15 years building. And for the first time, he saw it from the outside. He saw the rigidity. The predetermined patterns. The commitment to form over function, to tradition over adaptation, to the way it has always been done over the way it might work better. He saw 20 students training to throw the same straight punch he had thrown at Bruce Lee, the same oizuki, the same hip rotation, the same line of attack, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who has been on the receiving end of the lesson, that every one of those punches would miss. Not because they were bad punches. Because they were predictable punches. Predetermined punches. Punches that announced themselves through shoulder drops and weight shifts and eye movements, punches that a man who could read bodies, a man standing in a t-shirt with his hands at his sides, would not simply evade but exploit. He didn't close the school. That's the movie version, the dramatic gesture, the overnight transformation, the montage of the old being swept away and the new being built. The real version was slower. Messier. More interesting. He began to change. Gradually. He introduced new ideas in small doses, the way a doctor introduces a new medication, carefully, watching for reactions, adjusting the dosage based on response. He started asking his students to spar outside their usual patterns. To attack with techniques from other systems. To throw punches that weren't oizuki, kicks that weren't meijeri, combinations that weren't in any kata. He introduced the concept of interception, not with Bruce's precision, not with that impossible speed, but as a principle. The idea that the moment of attack is also the moment of maximum vulnerability. That meeting force with redirection rather than opposition is not weakness but efficiency. Some students embraced it. The curious ones. The ones who had always felt, at the edges of their training, that the system was a room with walls they couldn't see. These students leaned in. They asked questions. They experimented. They failed. Interception is easy to understand and extraordinarily difficult to execute, but they failed in productive ways, in ways that opened new doors rather than reinforcing old ones. Other students left. The purists. The traditionalists. The ones who had come for karate, capital K, formalized, belt system, kata performing, tournament competing karate, and who did not sign up for a philosophical revolution led by an instructor who had come back from a single visit to a small room in Los Angeles speaking in metaphors about water. They left quietly, or they left loudly, or they left with letters to the Regional Karate Association questioning the karatists' loyalty to the art. He let them go. It hurt. Losing students always hurts, especially when the students leaving are the ones who trusted you most, but the alternative was pretending that 6 seconds hadn't happened. And he couldn't do that. His back remembered the floor too well. Years passed. The school evolved. Karate remained the foundation. He never abandoned it, never disrespected it, never pretended that 15 years of training had been worthless. But the walls around it came down. Judo came in. Boxing came in. Wrestling came in. Concepts from Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do, interception, economy of motion, the rejection of predetermined patterns filtered through the curriculum like water through soil, changing the composition without destroying the structure. 30 years later, the karatist school looked nothing like it had in 1967. It was a mixed martial arts space before that term existed. Before the UFC. Before Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu entered the American consciousness. Before the idea that no single system has all the answers became so mainstream that it now feels obvious. In 1967, it wasn't obvious. It was heresy. And the karatist had committed it because a man in a t-shirt put him on the floor 3 times and then explained, with terrifying gentleness, that the floor was where his assumptions had always been heading. He'd just never met anyone who could show him the route. He tells his students about Bruce Lee. Not the movie star. Not the legend with the nunchucks and the yellow jumpsuit and the flying kicks that launched 1,000 imitators. The man in the t-shirt. The small room. The 6 seconds. 30 years, he tells them. And I still can't explain those 6 seconds. Not technically, I understand the biomechanics now. I've studied them. I've read everything Bruce wrote, everything that's been written about him, every analysis by every sports scientist and martial arts researcher who's tried to quantify what he could do. I understand the principles. I can diagram the force vectors. I can explain the kinetic chains and the interception window and the vectoral redirection of committed momentum. He pauses here. He always pauses here. But understanding the mechanics and understanding how a human being executed them in real time, against a committed attack, from a standing start. With that level of precision, those are 2 different things. I can explain how a piano works. That doesn't mean I can play Chopin. 6 seconds to fall. 6 months to process. 6 years to rebuild. 30 to understand. And even then, not fully. Some things don't fit inside understanding. They live next to it. Just out of reach. Visible but untouchable. Like a man in a t-shirt who moves in a way that your eyes can see and your brain can't file. Like a room so small it shouldn't contain anything important, and yet it contains the thing that rearranges your life. Like a number, 6, that shouldn't be long enough to matter, and yet it's the hinge that everything else swings on. The man sitting across from me finishes his coffee. Those rebuilt hands set the cup down with a gentleness that seems practiced, the deliberate care of a man who learned, a long time ago, that the impressive thing is not how much force you can generate but how precisely you can withhold it. I went there to save Coburn from a con man, he says. I drove across town with a speech in my head and 15 years of training in my body and the absolute certainty that I was right. I was going to spar with this little Chinese guy and put him on the floor and call my friend and say, James, I told you so. He looks at his hands. He put me on the floor 3 times in 18 seconds. And I couldn't tell you how. Not then. Not now. Not with 30 years of thinking about it and a library full of books and a school full of students who've heard this story so many times they can probably tell it better than I can. He's quiet for a moment. The cafe noise fills the space, cups, conversation, the anonymous machinery of a public place. Then he says the thing I drove 3 hours to hear. The thing that makes this story more than an anecdote. I walked in there a karate man. I walked out something else. Not a Jeet Kune Do man, Bruce wouldn't have wanted that. Not a convert to his system. He didn't have a system. That was the whole point. I walked out a man who understood, for the first time, that the system I'd been living inside was a room. A good room. A room with strong walls and a solid floor and 15 years of furniture I'd built with my own hands. But a room. And Bruce opened a door I didn't know was there and showed me what was on the other side. He pauses. What was on the other side? He almost smiles. Everything else. The karatist never saw Bruce Lee again. He wrote a letter to the school, called the number, made inquiries through the martial arts network. By then Bruce was in Hong Kong. By then Bruce was becoming something that a small room in Los Angeles couldn't contain and a 6-second encounter couldn't represent. By then Bruce was becoming Bruce Lee, the global phenomenon, the cultural earthquake, the man who kicked a door open that had been locked for a century. And then Bruce was gone. 1973. 32 years old. The karatist heard the news the way most people in the martial arts world heard it, by phone, passed from one stunned voice to another like a signal degrading across a long wire. He hung up. He stood in his school. He looked at the wooden dummy he'd installed in the corner, a Wing Chun dummy, the same kind Bruce had in his room, purchased 3 months after that visit because the karatist needed a piece of that space in his own space. He looked at it and felt the particular heaviness of a world that has lost something it didn't know it needed until it was gone. 6 seconds. That's all he'd had. 1 visit. 3 exchanges. 18 seconds of physical contact, if you could even call it contact, since the karatist was never sure Bruce had actually touched him with intent rather than simply touched his momentum and let gravity do the rest. 18 seconds out of a life that lasted 32 years. A fraction so small it shouldn't have mattered. It mattered. It's still mattering, in a cafe, 30-some years later, in the rebuilt hands and careful voice of a man who drove across town in 1967 to expose a fraud and found, instead, the thing that would define the rest of his life. I don't know if this story happened exactly the way he told it to me. Memory reshapes. 30 years of retelling polishes some surfaces and obscures others. The 6 seconds may have been 7, or 5, or 8. The specific technique Bruce used may have been slightly different from the reconstruction I showed the UCLA professor. The words Bruce spoke afterward may have been edited by decades of reflection into something cleaner and more poetic than what was actually said in a small room by a man in a t-shirt who had just put a regional karate champion on the floor 3 times. But the core is true. I believe that the way I believe things that have been carried for a long time by someone who has no reason to embellish them. The karatist didn't tell me this story to make himself look good, the story makes him look foolish, at least at the beginning. He didn't tell it to aggrandize Bruce Lee. He's not a Bruce Lee disciple, not a member of any Jeet Kune Do lineage, not a man with a poster on his wall. He told it because it happened to him and it changed him, and after 30 years he still needed someone to hear it and understand that 6 seconds can contain a lifetime's worth of education. I believe him. Not because I'm credulous. Because I've heard too many similar accounts from too many unconnected sources to dismiss them. The speed. The precision. The experience of being on the floor without understanding how you arrived there. The sense that what happened was not a fight but a lesson delivered in a language your conscious mind couldn't translate. These details repeat across dozens of accounts from people who encountered Bruce Lee in informal settings, not demonstrations, not films, not choreographed showcases. Real encounters. Unrehearsed moments. The places where the truth of a man's ability is tested by someone who hasn't agreed to cooperate. 6 seconds. 1 breath. The time it takes to read a short sentence or take a sip of water or glance out a window and back. In 6 seconds, a man who had spent 15 years building a fortress of certainty discovered that the fortress had no roof. That the sky had been there the whole time, visible to anyone who thought to look up, and that he had been so busy reinforcing the walls that he'd never raised his eyes. In 6 seconds, a 240-pound body learned that mass is a loan, not a gift. That the weight you carry into a fight is only yours as long as you control it, and the moment you commit it to a line of attack, it belongs to whoever understands vectors better than you do. In 6 seconds, 10,000 punches, the entire accumulated library of a martial artist's physical education, were revealed to be one punch, thrown 10,000 times. And one man, standing in a room with his hands at his sides, had read that punch before it left the hip and written a response in the margin that the karatist would spend 3 decades trying to decipher. I drove home from that cafe thinking about frameworks. About the structures we build around ourselves, intellectual, physical, professional, and how they serve us until they don't. About how the thing that makes you strong at 25 can make you brittle at 30. About how the most dangerous moment in any discipline is the moment you stop questioning it. The moment the system becomes not a tool but an identity. Because tools can be replaced when they break. Identities can't. When your identity breaks, you don't get a new one from the shelf. You sit on a floor in a small room and you look up at a ceiling you didn't plan to see, and you start, slowly and painfully and with no guarantee of success, to build something new from the wreckage of something old. The karatist did that. It took him 30 years. He's still doing it. In his 70s, in a school that looks nothing like the one he started with, teaching principles instead of forms, asking his students to question everything, including him, because a man in a t-shirt once showed him what happens when you don't. There's one more thing he told me. At the end. When the coffee was finished and the recorder was off and we were standing in the parking lot of the cafe. 2 men squinting in the afternoon sun. He said, "People ask me what Bruce Lee was like. Movie people, journalists, students who find out I met him once. They want the legend. They want the myth. They want me to tell them about the supernatural speed and the 1-inch punch and the mystical Eastern warrior who could do things no human should be able to do." He shook his head. He wasn't any of that. He was a man in a t-shirt who understood physics better than anyone I've ever met. He wasn't supernatural. He was natural. Completely, terrifyingly natural. He was what a human body can do when you strip away every assumption and every tradition and every comfortable lie and just let it work. That's what scared me. Not that he was more than human. That he was exactly human. And the rest of us were less. He got in his car. An old sedan, clean, well-maintained. The car of a man who takes care of things. He started the engine and then he rolled down the window and looked at me one more time. 6 seconds, he said. You know what the worst part is? I threw my best punch. My absolute best. The punch I'd been perfecting for 15 years. And he didn't even block it. He just wasn't there. And then I was on the floor and he was standing over me and I realized my best wasn't even in the conversation. My best was talking to itself in an empty room. His worst, the smallest, most casual thing he could do was enough. More than enough. He put the car in gear. That's what 6 seconds teaches you. Not that you're bad. That the scale is bigger than you thought. That the mountain is taller than the map showed. And that somewhere up there, past the clouds, past the part you can see, there's a man in a t-shirt, standing with his hands at his sides, waiting for you to stop throwing punches at the air and start asking better questions. He drove away. I stood in the parking lot for a while. The sun was doing what the sun does in Southern California, hanging in the sky like it owns the place, which, to be fair, it does. I thought about 6 seconds. About how a number that small can contain a number that large. About the karatist at 14, walking into his first dojo, feeling the world click into place. About the karatist at 29, walking into Bruce Lee's school, feeling the world click out of place. About the 30 years in between the second click and the parking lot where I was standing, and all the students he'd taught and the forms he'd abandoned and the walls he'd taken down and the questions he'd learned to ask instead of the answers he'd learned to defend. 6 seconds to fall. 6 months to process. 6 years to rebuild. 30 to understand. And at the end of all that time, at the end of all that work, all that study, all that patient and painful reconstruction of a life built on a foundation that turned out to be provisional, a man in his 70s, sitting in a cafe, holding a coffee cup with hands that could break concrete, saying the truest thing I've heard in 2 years of research. I can explain how a piano works. That doesn't mean I can play Chopin. The small room is still there. Or maybe it isn't, I haven't been able to confirm the exact address, and Los Angeles has a habit of erasing its own history with bulldozers and permit applications. But somewhere in the city, on a side street that most people would drive past without a second glance, there was a room. Small. Clean. Mirrors on one wall. A wooden dummy in the corner. A shelf near the door where envelopes were placed and not discussed. In that room, a man in a t-shirt showed another man that the world was larger than his walls. Not by lecturing. Not by arguing. Not by demonstrating superiority or claiming authority or any of the things that people do when they want to change your mind. By opening a door. By standing aside. By letting 240 pounds of certainty walk through that door and discover, on the other side, a floor. And from that floor, from the view of a ceiling you didn't choose, in a room you came to conquer, looking up at a man who weighs less than your doubt, the world looks different. Not smaller. Not simpler. Bigger. So much bigger that 30 years isn't enough to see the edges. Coburn knew this. The karatist knows this now. The students who came after, the names I haven't told you yet, the stories I haven't had time for, the people who walked through that door expecting one thing and finding something that rearranged everything, they all know it. There was another man who found his way to that room. Not through Coburn. Not through the martial arts network. Through a completely different door, driven by a completely different need. A need that had nothing to do with fighting and everything to do with something he'd been losing, slowly, publicly, in front of cameras and audiences and a world that was watching him flail. He was more famous than Coburn. More competitive. More unwilling to be second best at anything. And what Bruce Lee showed him had nothing to do with punches or stances or the physics of interception. It had to do with fear. His name was Steve McQueen. And that story is next.